I was in the break room when it happened, half a stale donut in my mouth, lukewarm coffee in hand, the usual Monday haze thick around my temples, when Travis Langston, our new Golden Boy COO, stormed down the hallway like he was chasing a damn ghost. Every heel strike echoed like thunder. Then, without knocking, he shoved open Mark's office door so hard the wall shook. I craned my neck just enough to see the tip of his designer shoe wedge itself between a chair and the filing cabinet. That's when I heard him bark it. "We found out you've been consulting for another firm after hours. Pack your desk." The room went silent. Dead silent. Not even Brenda's mechanical keyboard dared to click. Mark just sat there for a beat, unmoving, like he hadn't heard him. Then he slowly, deliberately closed his compliance binder, stood up, straightened his tie with one hand, and replied in the most unbothered voice I've ever heard. "Understood." That's it. No defense, no shouting, no, "you're making a mistake." He didn't even ask which firm they were talking about. He just walked out with his usual slow, steady steps. Same way he always moved around the office, like gravity worked a little differently for him. You could practically hear Travis's ego ballooning in his chest. He glanced around to make sure everyone had seen his little power play, his version of a public flogging. "Hey, real quick, if you're already hooked by this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Seriously, over 97% of people listen without subscribing, and it means the world to our team. All right, back to it. Now, here's the thing about Mark DeWitt. Most folks just saw a quiet compliance analyst who kept to himself, always stayed late, and looked like he ironed his shirts with a ruler. He didn't laugh much, never joined our birthday potlucks, the kind of guy who'd send you a Slack message instead of walking the 4 steps to your desk. But I'd worked late with him once. One of those nights when a system audit had gone sideways and Travis, in all his brilliance, decided to nuke our SOP folders at midnight. Mark stayed until 2 a.m. helping me untangle it. Said maybe things should break sometimes, just so we remember how they're built. It stuck with me. So watching him get axed like that, it didn't sit right. Especially when Travis strutted down the hall afterward like he'd just slain a dragon. "Clean in house," he said to no one in particular. He even high-fived Greg from logistics, the same Greg who thinks 2-factor authentication is a sandwich combo. And you know what really twisted the knife? Travis looked relieved after firing Mark, like he'd gotten rid of a pest. That's when I knew something was off. Mark wasn't the kind of guy to get sloppy, and he damn sure wasn't the kind to moonlight without permission. Then I remembered the binder. Mark had left it, up on the top shelf of his office bookshelf, the one labeled Dormant Investigations, Level 3. Nobody but Mark ever touched that thing. It was basically his Bible. The few of us who worked late knew about it, mostly because he treated it like it contained launch codes. And now it was just there, sitting like a forgotten relic while Travis held his chest out like he'd just optimized workflow by throwing a human being into the street. I saw Emma, our newest intern, hovering outside Mark's office like she wanted to go in. She looked like a scared rabbit. I waved her off. "Not a good idea," I mouthed, and she slinked away. But I couldn't stop thinking about that binder, or the fact that Mark didn't even look surprised. If anything, he seemed prepared. 2 hours later, HR sent out a company-wide email. "Please note, Mark DeWitt is no longer with the company. Questions regarding his project should be directed to Travis Langston." I read it 3 times, each more insulting than the last. No thank you, no farewell. Just erased like a whiteboard mistake. But then something weird happened. I saw the printer light up next to Mark's old desk. I walked over, half on instinct, and saw one page spit out before the printer groaned and died. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a line at the top. "Effective today, State Inspection Protocol V7.4 goes live at 0900. Below it, one line in smaller font. Final confirmation timestamp. M. DeWitt. Auto 6:59 a.m. I blinked. That was this morning. And right then, like clockwork, a black SUV pulled into the visitor parking lot outside. No company logo, tinted windows. 3 people stepped out, suits stiff enough to cut glass, badges already in hand. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. Mark hadn't been consulting for another company. He'd been consulting for the state. I went back to his office. I shouldn't have. HR had already started locking down his access, and technically the room was supposed to be reassigned by end of day. But something about how he left it. It didn't feel accidental. His desk was cleared, sure, but everything else was too tidy, like he was staging a crime scene for someone to find later. And then there it was, top shelf. Hard to see unless you were looking for it. His signature black binder with the silver label, Dormant Investigations, Level 3. We used to joke that Mark invented his own clearance levels just to feel important. But that label? That wasn't a joke. That was a warning. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Emma, the intern, stood beside me, biting her lip, glancing between the shelf and the hallway like she expected Travis to materialize out of nowhere with a flamethrower. Should we, I don't know, turn that in or something? She whispered. I don't think that's what he wanted, I said, and I meant it. Because this wasn't carelessness. Mark never left anything unbuttoned. Not his email, not his coffee cup, not his compliance logs. I once saw him draft a 6-page incident report for a mislabeled cleaning solution. He triple-signed it. No way he'd just forget his most sensitive binder unless he wanted someone to find it. Emma stepped closer and pointed. Wait, there's something sticking out of the top. Sure enough, tucked between pages like a flag was a slip of paper, old-school perforated printout, the kind we hadn't used since finance purged the archives. One edge curled from heat, like it had been left on a radiator. I plucked it out and read the top line, Internal Flag Request, triggered 12/1/06:59 a.m. Underneath, 3 words, List confirmed. Synced. I stared at it like it might explode. I didn't fully know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't something you leave by accident. Mark was playing a long game, and that slip of paper wasn't a loose end. It was a fuse. The binder was heavier than I expected when I pulled it down. I flipped it open to the first tab. Level 3 cases, not yet escalated. Each case number had a set of red highlights, timestamps, initials. Some were closed, but some were still wide open. And those, every single one led back to one department, Ops and Logistics, Travis's kingdom. I thought he was just weird, Emma said, barely above a whisper. Like, paranoid, the kind of guy who overdoes it so he doesn't get blamed later. No, I said, he was building a trap. There were charts in that binder, flow diagrams, network access logs, a full appendix of policy breaches sorted by risk tier. And not just anyone's violations. These were directly tied to changes Travis had made over the past 6 months. Purged inventory tracking, downgraded sign-off protocols, missing monthly checklists. And then there was the memo. Memo to self. Timestamp 11/30/2347. If this reaches external review, initiate sequence per 7.4. Attach cross-index. No public statement. Binder must remain accessible until 09/0. Emma read it over my shoulder and let out a shaky breath. Is this even legal? It's compliance, I muttered. Legal doesn't even scratch the surface. We didn't say anything after that. Just stood there in that too quiet office while the air got heavier. I'd seen people fired before. I'd seen them escorted out. I'd seen tears, tantrums, threats. But Mark didn't cry, didn't yell. He just left behind this quiet bombshell, wedged neatly between laminated tabs and faded Post-its. I slid the slip of paper back where I found it and shut the binder. Outside, you could hear heels clacking fast. Too fast. Somewhere, someone had just realized those folks from the black SUV weren't here for a courtesy visit, and I'd bet every paycheck I'll ever earn that Mark knew exactly what time they'd walk through the front doors. By the time the daily stand-up rolled around, Travis was already glowing like he'd cured cancer with a PowerPoint. He strutted into conference room B with his shirt just a little too tight across the chest, sleeves rolled like he'd spent the morning fixing a damn carburetor instead of gutting our SOPs. He plopped his phone on the table, screen up, like a trophy. It buzzed twice. Slack messages from God knows who, but he didn't even flinch. He was riding too high. Well, he began, clapping his hands once, loud enough to snap half the team out of their iPad-induced comas. I took care of our little leak. Everyone shifted uncomfortably. No one asked who he meant. We didn't need to. Mark's desk was already wiped clean, badge disabled, inbox locked. It was as if he'd never existed. Travis smirked like he'd performed a mercy killing. Compliance, he said, practically spitting the word. Too many cooks in the damn kitchen. I went ahead and archived anything older than Q3. Honestly, most of those SOPs were just fluff, redundant. We don't need 3 different sign-off sheets for inbound materials. 1 checkbox. Done. The silence was deafening. Susan from QA cleared her throat. You mean you deleted them? Correct, Travis said, like he was being praised. Archived, purged, removed, whatever term makes you feel better. Bottom line, streamlined. No more hoops to jump through. We're lean now. It hit me then. This wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. He knew what he was doing, he just didn't care. Every log Mark had warned about, every system he flagged for chain of custody issues, Travis had torched it like it was old birthday decorations. His version of leadership was a flamethrower and a cigar. But those logs, said Jared from procurement, flipping through a thin folder. Weren't we supposed to submit those for the quarterly recertification? The state? Oh, relax. Travis cut in, waving a dismissive hand. Nobody reads those reports. We submit them, they check a box, everybody moves on. It's all bureaucracy, smoke and mirrors. I caught the CFO's expression. Vivian Chang isn't someone you interrupt lightly, and right now her eyes were narrowing behind those glasses in a way that made me think maybe she'd done some quiet reading of those SOPs herself. She folded her hands. Are we still expecting that state compliance recertification this quarter? Travis didn't even blink. Yep, end of month, but I've already got that handled. I had legal copy over the last report and scrubbed the irrelevant stuff. Should pass without issue. You copied the last one? Vivian, he said, leaning forward like he was about to teach her how email works. These inspections are rubber stamps. No one has time to audit the whole process. They check keywords, look for a signature, maybe glance at 1 or 2 records. Trust me, I've worked with these guys before. That was the moment I saw 3 people exchange glances. Not big ones. Just enough to clock concern. Enough to register that someone, maybe more than one, was starting to realize we'd sailed off the map. Travis kept rolling. Besides, Mark was a bottleneck, always flagging things that didn't matter. He acted like every missing sticker was an act of God. We don't need that kind of fear-based workflow anymore. We need agility. Agility. Jesus. He was speaking in LinkedIn quotes now. He stood up, smoothed his sleeves like he was prepping for a TED Talk, and dropped the last nail into his own coffin without even knowing it. We're not a compliance shop. We're a growth engine. Anyone not aligned with that? Gone. I watched the room. No one applauded. No one challenged him either. And that's how you know fear works, when silence does all the talking. I left that meeting with a pit in my stomach and a fistful of dread, because I'd seen Mark's binder. I knew the logs were gone. I knew what should have been submitted. And I had a very bad feeling that whatever those SUV-suited state agents were here to find, they were going to find nothing. Which, in our line of work, that's worse than finding something. The scent of burnt bacon and artificial maple syrup clung to the air like old gossip. Booth vinyl stuck to the back of my thighs, and the coffee was strong enough to trigger cardiac regret. But across from me, in the far corner of the Sunshine Diner, Mark DeWitt sat in total stillness, his fingers moving in short, deliberate strokes across the keyboard of a laptop that looked like it'd never seen a single cat meme. He didn't look up when I slid into the booth across from him. Didn't smile, didn't offer a hello. Just tilted the screen an inch, enough for me to see the dashboard. It looked like something out of a submarine. Timestamps, color-coded alerts, column headers with names like Entry Trigger 0900 AM and Automated Flag Expired Checklists. Below that, a blinking green bar labeled Audit Sync Ready, Status Armed. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Mark, is this what I think it is? He sipped his coffee, black, no sugar, like a punishment, and finally spoke. Depends. What do you think it is? I leaned closer. You've been syncing internal audits to an external node? He didn't nod, didn't confirm, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. I'd worked with this man for years. He didn't do twitches. You knew they'd wipe your logs, I whispered. I knew Travis would try to impress someone by deleting what he didn't understand, Mark replied flatly. He's a PowerPoint thinker. Compliance doesn't fit in a slide. I glanced back at the screen. One line pulsed yellow. T minus 00.1842. External entry initiated. Another flashed. Checklist review locked. 17 discrepancies queued for flag. The sick thing? He wasn't gloating. There was no ego in his voice, no smug satisfaction. Just that same clinical calm he always had when filing breach reports at midnight. Like he was just tending a garden and the weeds happened to be carrying MBA degrees. Outside, the building loomed like nothing was wrong. I could see the 8th floor lights still on, Travis's glass-paneled throne room, the same place he'd thrown Mark out of not 24 hours ago. "So what happens at 9?" I asked. Mark shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that hides a chessboard. A notification batch is sent to the state inspection system. Real-time data dump. Document timestamps, signature inconsistencies, audit trails. "You mean what used to be audit trails?" "No," he said quietly, finally turning his eyes to me. "I mean the backups I made when I knew Travis would wipe them." I didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Probably both. Another timer on the screen blinked red for a second and then went solid green. Regulatory ping response. Verified. "Mark," I said, my voice low, "you're not just reporting us." "I'm not reporting you," he replied. "But Travis? He's about to learn what happens when you treat compliance like a janitorial task." Outside, a black SUV turned the corner and rolled to a slow stop in front of our building. It didn't park in visitor. It parked in reserved. Bold. 3 people stepped out. Black blazers, clipboards, no expressions. Mark didn't even turn to watch. He just took another sip of coffee. I looked back at the laptop. A new line had appeared. Entry detected 08-5941. Mark spoke again, quieter this time. "Funny thing about compliance data, everyone thinks the danger is when you have too much. The real threat is when you suddenly have none. That's when auditors start asking the kinds of questions you can't PowerPoint your way out of." I sat back in the booth, heart pounding louder than it had any right to in a pancake joint. Across the street, the receptionist was already standing, her mouth moving fast as one of the agents held up a badge. Inside the diner, Mark quietly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to me like it weighed nothing. "If anything happens," he said, "give this to Vivian Chang." "What's in it?" "Something she'll know how to read." The agent reached for the door handle of the building. 9 Odzarzo. Mark's dashboard pinged once. He closed the laptop, drained his cup, and finally smiled. But it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that says, checkmate, even if the board's still warm. I was watching from the hallway, halfway through stapling a quarterly review packet that no one would ever read, when it happened. The glass doors whispered open like they knew trouble was coming in, and 3 people walked in with the kind of posture that makes your spine remember sins you haven't committed yet. Black suits, leather folders, clean badges that caught the light in that sharp, surgical way. Not salespeople, not vendors, state. The receptionist, Janine, stood up so fast she knocked over her water bottle. It hit the laminate floor with a splat, but nobody looked down. Her hands fumbled for the visitor sign-in sheet like it mattered, like anyone that confident was going to waste a pen stroke on bureaucracy. One of the agents held up a badge. The state seal glinted like a warning. You're early," Janine said, voice trembling just a little. "We weren't told to expect." The lead investigator didn't smile, didn't blink, just said, "That's the point." You could hear the shift, that invisible drop in air pressure that only comes when something big, very big, is about to go sideways. It spread from the front desk to the corner offices like ink in water. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Phones were lifted but not answered. A junior manager in the copy room stepped out to check the weather, but his eyes were locked on the lobby. He saw it too. The agents didn't ask to wait. They didn't sit. They didn't even pretend to be polite. They walked in like the building already belonged to them, and in a way, it did. The lead tapped his ID again and said one word to Janine: compliance. Then they disappeared into the elevator, doors closing silently behind them. No one breathed until it dinged. On floor 8, I imagine it hit like a slap. Travis had been running his mouth all morning about reorg momentum and how dead weight like Mark was exactly what held companies back from greatness. He'd even joked about turning Mark's old office into a war room. I'd seen Greg from logistics hauling in a whiteboard like it was a conquest. They were all peacocking in the conference suite when the elevator opened and spilled law into their fishbowl. I wasn't in the room, but Emma was. She told me later that Travis actually smiled when they walked in, thinking they were part of a pitch or some VIP tour. He didn't recognize the badges. The lead investigator opened his folder. I'm Investigator Salgado, Division of Regulatory Standards. We're conducting a compliance audit under Provision 7.4. This is an unannounced review. Travis's grin dropped so fast Emma thought he was choking. He opened his mouth, probably to bluff or bullshit, but Salgado wasn't done. I need access to your batch trace logs, last quarter's deviation reports, and all internal checklists tied to your inbound inventory workflows. We'll also need chain of custody documentation for lots 846 and 849B. Emma said you could feel the panic swell behind Travis's eyes. He gestured to the assistant director like she might magically pull a rabbit out of the server room. Sure, yes. Just give us a second to get all that pulled. It's archived, I believe. No, Salgado replied. You were supposed to submit digital access credentials to the state portal last week. You missed that deadline. This isn't a request. It's an inspection. Now. Someone fumbled and dropped a laptop. Another whispered, "Where the hell are those logs?" Loud enough for everyone to hear. And that's when I knew. Mark hadn't just sent them in with a few red flags and a paper trail. He'd launched a full-blown compliance missile directly into Travis's command center, knowing the man had already deleted the shields. Back in the reception area, Janine sat frozen, staring down the hallway like she might need to run. She leaned toward me and whispered, "They didn't bring donuts." What? Last time State came, they brought donuts, sat in the boardroom, gave us a checklist, told us to clean it up. I shook my head. Not this time. And sure enough, as if the universe wanted to double underline the point, I saw one of the agents pull out a sealed envelope, the name on the front, prepared by Monsieur DeWitt. Janine saw it too. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, this isn't just an inspection." "No," I said, "it's a reckoning." The air in the 8th floor conference room had gone thin. The blinds were still open from Travis's sunlight-mastered clarity speech that morning. But no one was soaking up inspiration now. 3 state auditors sat evenly spaced along the edge of the long glass table, not bothering with small talk or pleasantries. They weren't here to coach or consult. They were here to tally sins. And Travis? He was unraveling in real time. "I'm sorry, what logs exactly are you referring to?" he asked, tugging at his collar like the fabric had just remembered it wasn't tailored for liars. Investigator Salgado didn't flinch. "Logs 73A, 73C, and 74D. We requested access to them via the state portal last week. Per Regulatory Standard 7.4, those were flagged for routine cross-verification. We need those records now." Travis looked toward Jenna, his assistant, like maybe she'd pull a rabbit out of SharePoint. She didn't. They were part of the redundancy purge last Wednesday, she said, voice brittle. The COO authorized the deletion. The room turned so quiet you could hear the HVC hum shift. Travis chuckled awkwardly, trying to pivot. "Look, a lot of those logs were just copy-paste relics from a previous cycle. They weren't useful anymore, and they were bloating our internal storage." "Redundancy doesn't negate requirement," Salgado said flatly. "Logs 73A and 74D were specifically flagged for discrepancy review based on anomalies submitted in your last quarterly self-assessment. Who authorized their removal?" Travis hesitated. "I did, based on recommendations from our internal audit." "We've reviewed your internal audit," said the woman to Salgado's left, flipping through a binder so thick it could stop bullets. "There's no such recommendation. In fact, there's no mention of logs 73 through 74 at all." Silence. Then, "We'll need your chain of custody reports for batches 846 and 849B, Salgado continued. "Your own labeling system designated them as elevated concern due to high material volatility. Those require a complete custody chain." Travis stood there, a man blinking through a minefield with no map. He looked at Jenna again. She was already pulling open drawers, scrolling through folders, dragging her mouse across 3 monitors like she was trying to reassemble the Titanic from blueprints. Then she stopped. The custody forms, they were routed through Legacy OpsNet, she said, eyes wide. That system was retired last Friday when IT pushed the protocol update. Retired. Gone. Wiped. Salgado's partner clicked her pen once. So no logs, no backups, and no custody documentation on your 2 highest risk product batches from last quarter. We had the data. This is a systems issue, not a compliance failure, Travis said, sweating now, trying to sound authoritative while visibly shrinking in his chair. One of the agents muttered just loud enough, "This reads like sabotage or gross negligence." That line hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't quite find, but know is eating the foundation. And then the third investigator, the quiet one in the back, pulled out a sealed envelope and slid it down the table to Salgado. It was cream-colored, thick paper, the kind you don't use for casual memos. Across the front, printed in sharp black ink, prepared by MC DeWitt for delivery upon trigger event. I saw Travis's face change completely. The color drained. The forced smirk he'd been clinging to like a security blanket slipped right off his lips. What? What is that? Salgado opened the envelope slowly, methodically. Inside was a 10-page dossier, paper-clipped and indexed. The first page had a simple title, Cross-Referenced Anomalies, 73A through 74D, with supporting documentation, export timestamps, and access logs. Salgado scanned it silently, then, without looking up, asked, "Was Mark DeWitt ever part of your internal audit review process?" Travis stammered. He was compliance, but he wasn't. That is, he didn't have authority to... He was listed as primary author on 6 of the 10 processes you submitted to the state last year. He was also one of 4 subject matter contributors on the current 7.4 protocol that governs today's inspection. Did you know that? I wasn't aware of that. No one said anything. No one needed to. Travis had fired the one man in the company who not only built the walls, they wrote the rulebook. And now that man's fingerprints were surfacing in every single place Travis had tried to hide. Salgado looked up for the first time in minutes. "We'll need to speak with your legal team, and if there are no objections, we'll begin device and credential isolation for all ops leadership immediately." Someone dropped a pen. Someone else stood up and quietly excused themselves. Travis just sat there, breathing through his nose, gripping the edge of the table like it might fly away. I stepped back from the glass, heart pounding. From across the street, I imagined Mark was still in that diner booth, sipping his coffee, checking the time. And right about now, he knew the walls were collapsing exactly on schedule. The sound of pages turning echoed like gunshots in that conference room. Salgado didn't rush. He read each line of the dossier the way a surgeon checks a chart before cutting. No wasted movement, no missed details. The second investigator began matching the list against a tablet, line by line, and the third started photographing every visible SOP pinned to the whiteboard. It stopped being an audit. It became a crime scene. Inside that envelope was a nuclear payload, a detailed, color-coded cross-reference of every compliance lapse, every falsified log, every internal exception that Travis had rubber-stamped, ignored, or actively deleted over the past quarter, and all of it tied back to his credentials. Each section began with the same phrase, "Origin discrepancy flagged, cross-verified by MC DeWitt." There were screenshots, time-stamped Slack messages, internal memos with Travis's digital signature approving procedural deletions. One in particular stood out, an email dated 4 months ago from Mark to Travis, warning that purging archived logs without duplication violated internal policy 12.4b and state guidelines 7.1. Travis's reply was a single line. "Stop being dramatic, Mark. No one's going to audit a ghost folder." Salgado read it aloud. Travis's hands clenched. That was taken out of context. The second auditor raised her eyebrows. "You sent it at 11:43 p.m., 2 hours after IT deployed an undocumented purge protocol. You also manually bypassed the archive retention flag, per the internal logs included in this report." Travis shifted in his chair like the room had turned to lava. Wait, where did you even get that? That folder was... And that's when it hit him. The realization crept up his spine like a wet wire. Who gave you this? He demanded, looking between the agents. This isn't public access. That data was internal. Who the hell gave you this report? No one answered at first, but then someone did. Someone in the corner who hadn't spoken all morning. Vivian Chang. She didn't look up from her tablet, didn't even move her head. She just said, in a voice so quiet it felt like a punch to the chest, "It's all signed by DeWitt." You could feel the bottom fall out of Travis's composure. He leaned back like the air had been sucked out of him, mouth half open, one hand twitching at his temple like he could somehow massage this all into a bad dream. No, he doesn't have clearance to share that. That was internal. Vivian finally met his eyes. You fired him. He was under NDA. Only until the moment you terminated him, she replied coldly, which you did in writing at 7:46 a.m. yesterday. His release of material evidence to a regulatory body was not only legal, it was required under his external engagement clause. Travis looked like he'd just swallowed a burning coal. What engagement clause? Salgado closed the folder. Mark DeWitt was an approved consultant for the State Compliance Board for the past 9 months. His work was sanctioned, compensated, and legally protected under whistleblower confidentiality. You didn't just fire your compliance analyst, Mr. Langston. He stood, slowly. You fired the co-author of the very protocol you're now failing to meet. The board had been notified 15 minutes earlier. Legal had already been looped in. The call logs were lighting up like Christmas. One director was pacing in the hallway. Another had locked themselves in their office with 2 phones and a box of Tums. But Travis? He just stood there, sweating through a shirt that cost more than my rent, watching his legacy fall apart one line item at a time. Mark hadn't yelled. Mark hadn't threatened. Mark had just written everything down, patiently, methodically, with timestamps and signatures, and then let gravity do the rest. And now Travis couldn't stop the fall. Travis couldn't sit still. He paced the room like a man rehearsing courtroom testimony that hadn't been requested yet. Every time someone shifted in their chair or cleared their throat, he jumped like the floor might collapse. But the worst part, the part that made even Greg from logistics sit bolt upright, was when he tried to bluff. I think it's pretty obvious what this is, Travis said, voice thin and desperate. This whole thing is revenge. DeWitt felt humiliated after I let him go, and now he's trying to sink the ship on his way out. You can't seriously take the word of a disgruntled ex-employee with a grudge. For a second, silence held, and then investigator Salgado stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to make the room go very, very still. We didn't just take his word, Mr. Langston, he said. We verified his documentation against third-party timestamps, internal audit schedules, and secure regulatory syncs conducted through our own channels. More importantly, Mark DeWitt didn't just file complaints. He stepped forward, slid one document across the table like a final card in a poker game. He helped write the regulations you're currently failing to follow. You could have dropped a paperclip and heard it scream. I'm sorry, what? Travis blinked. DeWitt was one of 5 advisory consultants on the development of Protocol 7.4, Salgado continued. The same framework you were warned about in your Q2 risk memo. His expertise isn't just respected, it's embedded. I looked over at Vivian Chang. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just sat back in her chair, folded her arms, and watched Travis like someone who'd been waiting months to see if he'd ever read a damn thing she sent him. We trusted his documentation, Salgado said plainly, because we trust the standard he helped create. You don't call that revenge, Mr. Langston. You call it compliance. Travis opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. He never said he was on the advisory board. Salgado raised an eyebrow. He wasn't obligated to. We were. Across the room, one of the board directors finally spoke. Until now, they'd sat frozen like statues, watching the collapse from behind their polished table. But now, the chairwoman leaned forward, hands clasped. What happens next? She asked. Salgado nodded. We begin a full corrective action sequence that includes departmental restructuring, digital access isolation, and oversight audits for any process DeWitt flagged. Another board member cleared his throat. Would it be appropriate to request Mr. DeWitt's assistance during that process as an external advisor? Travis stepped forward fast. Too fast. Absolutely not. That would be a conflict. He's biased. He's clearly retaliating. This entire mess started because you deleted critical compliance documentation and circumvented internal policy, Vivian interrupted, voice sharp enough to cut marble. Let's not rewrite the timeline. But he can't just waltz back in like some compliance messiah, Travis snapped. He's not waltzing anywhere, the chairwoman replied coolly. We're talking about temporary sanctioned advisory input during a period of regulatory distress. Salgado shrugged. He's already been briefed. We reached out this morning. His availability begins next Monday. Travis's jaw dropped. You already hired him back? No, the chairwoman said, rising to her feet. We're not rehiring him. She let the silence hang there like smoke from a slow fire. We're asking him to lead. And with that, the conversation shifted. No more questions about Mark's motives, no more doubts about his data. The man they dismissed as a paper-pushing fossil? He'd quietly become the one person they now needed to keep the company from collapsing in on itself. And Travis? He just stood there, watching the power drain from the room like blood from a wound he didn't know he had. Recognition had finally arrived, but not for him. It was raining that morning. Not the dramatic kind, just a steady gray drizzle that soaked into your bones and made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath. I was walking back from grabbing coffee when I saw the familiar silhouette coming up the steps. Same trench coat, same worn leather briefcase, same unshakable gait like nothing could knock him off balance. Mark DeWitt. But this time, there was no badge swipe, no employee fob. He walked through the front doors, flanked by 2 state officers, and the new receptionist, a temp from HR, stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her stapler. Mr. DeWitt, sir, He offered her a polite nod. Here for the scheduled review. His voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still just north of monotone. But everything else about the moment felt seismic. Upstairs, the 8th floor was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No music humming from someone's Bluetooth speaker. No pointless stand-up meetings about core value reinforcements. Just silence. Like the whole place knew someone important was on their way and didn't quite know what to do with that knowledge. Mark walked with measured steps past rows of cubicles that had once belonged to people who ignored him. Past glass offices that used to shut their blinds when he walked by. Past the now empty corner suite where Travis Langston had once called him dead weight. That office had been cleared out a week ago. The plaque was gone. The blinds were open. A single document was taped to the inside of the door. Notice of findings. Violations under State Protocol 7.4 Primary Accountability. Travis Langston, former Chief Operations Officer. I watched as Mark stopped in front of it. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, just stared for a moment, like a man observing a landmark that no longer stood. Then he turned, walked 2 more doors down, and stepped into his old office. It had been untouched since the day he left. No one wanted to inherit the desk of a man who walked out with dignity and left behind a ticking time bomb. But I noticed something strange. His binder was still there. Dormant investigations, level 3, right where he left it on the top shelf, gathering a thin coat of dust like the office had been holding its breath too. Mark reached up, pulled it down, and opened it slowly. Flipped through a few tabs. Pulled out 1 page, folded it into thirds, and slid it into his briefcase. Then he turned, and for the first time since his return, looked directly at someone. Emma. She'd just stepped off the elevator, carrying a stack of reports and a nervous expression. The same intern who'd once stayed late with him, who had watched the building from behind a window while everything burned down around Travis. She froze when she saw him, half out of shock, half out of memory. Mark gave her a slight nod, not a greeting, a thank you. Then he walked into the main conference room without knocking. Everyone was already inside. The board, legal, QA leads, 2 new compliance hires who looked like they were auditioning for their first adult panic attack. Salgado was at the head of the table, but when Mark entered, he stepped aside without hesitation. Mark set the binder down on the table, clicked it open, looked at no one in particular, and finally said, in a voice that didn't need volume to hold weight, "Now, where were we?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The man they once called excessive was now the reason the company still had a license to operate. He didn't shout. He didn't slam a door. He just returned. Not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as the one person in the room with the authority to decide who stayed and who didn't.